Piers Morgan thought he could toss a subtle jab and move on. But Jungkook's calm, cutting response didn't just shift the room, it turned the entire internet upside down. The dressing room at ITV Studios in London felt sterile. Not cold in temperature, but in feeling. Polished to the point of lifelessness, like no one expected a real person to sit in it. Jungkook sat quietly, elbows resting on the armrest, the glow of his phone fading to black in his hand. A young assistant had just stepped out, gently reminding him he had 10 minutes before going on Piers Morgan Uncensored. He took a breath, not from nerves. He had stood before millions on stages far brighter. But this felt different. Maybe it was the call 2 days earlier. His publicist had warned him. "They're calling it a conversation about free speech and sensitivity," she'd said carefully. "But if Piers takes it where I think he might, they're setting a trap. Just be ready." Jungkook hadn't replied then. He didn't need to. He'd been on enough panels that opened with polite smiles and closed with backhanded remarks. What was new was the silence when he arrived. No offer of tea, no greeting from producers. He heard muffled laughter down the hall. Laughter that abruptly stopped the moment he stepped into the green room. He didn't need confirmation. He'd felt this before. A quiet knock. His assistant poked her head in. 2 minutes. Jungkook stood, straightened the crisp lines of his charcoal blazer. No glitter, no drama. Just precision, just presence. He glanced in the mirror. No cracks, no space for them, not tonight. As he walked toward the stage, they passed the iconic photo wall, all grayscale portraits of outspoken hosts and media kings, men in suits, men with platforms, men who never had to watch their tone to avoid being labeled too emotional on national TV. On set, Jungkook greeted Piers with a calm, polite nod. Piers gave the smallest smirk, gesturing toward the seat across from him, like he was already enjoying a private joke only he found funny. Lights up, applause sign blinking, theme music fading out. "We're back," Piers said, leaning in with half a grin. "And our next guest, well, you know him, global superstar, activist, voice of a generation, Jungkook of BTS, an icon, unless emotion gets in the way." A light ripple of laughter floated from the audience. Jungkook tilted his head slightly, not confused but calculating. He crossed his legs, folded his hands, and kept his face still. "Happy to be here," he said. His voice was calm, centered, like stone. Piers smiled tightly. "Let's start simple. Why does everything have to be so moralized these days? Why can't people just take a joke?" Jungkook didn't answer immediately. He blinked once, then gave a slight nod, as if this was the exact line he'd been warned about. What came next wasn't anger. It was quieter, sharper, more dangerous to anyone who thought they had him figured out. Jungkook leaned in just a bit, not to confront, just to take up space. Then in the same even tone he spoke. "You say moralizing, I say standing up for people who never get heard." "Moralizing, huh?" Jungkook repeated, his voice soft but unflinching. "I think you mean standing up for people who usually don't get heard." Piers smirked, leaning back. "Right. But don't you think sometimes passion gets in the way of actually getting things done? There's a lot of yelling, not a lot of results. It's like everyone's trying to go viral instead of govern." A few polite, awkward chuckles floated through the crowd. Jungkook didn't smile. "I get it," he said, tone level and deliberate. "Young people, especially when they're Korean or Black or from any community that's been told to stay quiet, get labeled emotional when they care too much, or angry when they speak directly. But someone else can shout, curse on live TV, and that's called passion. Interesting, isn't it?" Piers shifted slightly in his chair. "You're making this about identity," he countered. "I'm talking about approach. People want solutions, not lectures. And I'm telling you," Jungkook replied calmly, "you can't separate identity from approach. If someone has spent their whole life watching their community be ignored, underfunded, blamed for problems they didn't create, what do you expect them to sound like when they finally get the mic? Soft?" The tension in the room thickened. The audience quieted, not from discomfort, but from anticipation. Something was shifting. Piers raised an eyebrow. "But isn't that the problem? The mic becomes a weapon instead of a tool. Every moment's a clapback. Activism feels more like performance these days. Jungkook chuckled, but it wasn't from humor. It was precision. It was a surgical strike. You know what's wild? He said, voice smooth but sharp. It's always been a stage. You just didn't notice when the same people were writing every scene. Now that someone new is reading from the script, suddenly it's performative. A quiet whoa rose from someone in the back. Others nodded. The camera didn't cut. It held on Piers' face as he awkwardly reached for his water. Okay, Piers said, trying to reset. Let's take the emotion out of it. Policy-wise, what's actually being done? Jungkook's expression didn't flicker. That, he said, depends. Do you mean what's being proposed or what's being blocked in? Piers tilted his head. Explain. And Jungkook did. Voting access. I helped push forward language that would have expanded polling sites, protected mail-in voting, guaranteed support for voters with disabilities. That's not emotional. That's structural. But every time we bring it up, someone accuses us of overreaching. So I ask, who's really holding progress back? Piers shrugged. Maybe it's just not that simple. No, Jungkook said plainly, never raising his voice, never blinking. It is that simple. What's complicated is trying to defend a system that works for some while pretending it works for everyone. A murmur rippled through the room. This wasn't the usual back and forth. No zingers, no forced laughs, just two very different realities in tension. And only one of them felt at home in that space. Piers crossed his leg, forcing a smile. Sounds like a good soundbite. Jungkook remained still. Maybe, he said coolly, or maybe it just sounds different because I didn't need to raise my voice to make the point. But Piers Morgan wasn't finished, and Jungkook knew it. What came next wasn't a question. It was a calculated strike. Piers leaned back in his chair, his smile slipping into something colder, more deliberate. His fingers tapped the armrest once, then again. Well, he said slowly, you talk a lot about how hard it is for people like you, but isn't part of leadership being able to take criticism without calling it oppression? The sentence landed with a chill. Not because it was loud, not because it was clever, but because it carried that smug undercurrent. The one that says, you're not allowed to call this what it is. For a long second, Jungkook didn't respond. He looked at Piers, really looked. Not like a celebrity facing a host, but like someone quietly deciding how much truth the room could handle. Then he turned slightly toward the audience, not with theatrics, just enough to acknowledge them. He didn't smile, he didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone changed. It slowed down, sharpened. Let me ask you something, he said quietly. If I sit here and explain how certain systems push people to the margins, and your first instinct is to say, I'm playing victim, what does that say about how you listen? Silence fell over the room. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that meant something was landing. No coughs, no whispers, just stillness. Jungkook continued, I'm not oppressed because someone disagrees with me. I'm pointing out a pattern, and the moment I name that pattern, the conversation shifts, not to whether the pattern exists, but to whether I'm being too sensitive. He paused just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. That's not debate, that's deflection. The camera cut to Piers. His expression faltered, not by much, but enough to reveal a momentary crack in confidence, a flicker of unease. Jungkook didn't move. His voice remained steady, unwavering. And let's be real, he said. You've built a whole career on saying the uncomfortable thing. You pride yourself on pushing back against the mainstream. But when someone like me does the same thing, when I challenge you directly, you don't call it brave. You call it emotional. Someone in the audience clapped, then another, then half the room joined in, nodding, leaning forward. Piers lifted his hand in a failed attempt to wave them down, offering a smile that didn't quite land. All right, he said, forcing a laugh. Let's keep it civil. Jungkook turned back to him, eyes steady, calm, unshaken. I am being civil, he said. I'm just not being small. The line cut through the studio like a blade. It didn't need to be loud. It didn't need dramatic delivery. That's what made it devastating. It wasn't just a response, it was a boundary, a correction, a declaration. And even Piers Morgan couldn't spin that. He sat back, exhaling, half scoff, half surrender, then reached for his notes, his fingers moving a bit faster now, like someone who'd lost his rhythm. And everyone in the room knew it. Not because they were on Jungkook's side, but because, for once, the story wasn't being filtered through sarcasm or spectacle. It was two worlds clashing, and the quieter one was winning. Jungkook didn't push further. He didn't need to. He leaned back, adjusted the cuff of his jacket, and waited for the next question. But the real shift didn't come from what he said. It came from what happened after. When the show ended and the world started reacting, the credits had barely finished rolling when his assistant, Minji, burst into the dressing room, breathless and wide-eyed, holding out his phone. "You're trending," she said. Jungkook raised an eyebrow, casually peeling off his mic. "Already #2 on X. And climbing," she added, holding the phone closer. Jungkook took it. His mentions were exploding. Screenshots, 15-second clips, reaction videos all zoomed in on one line. "I'm just not being small." It was everywhere. Memes, GIFs, dramatic piano edits. That phrase typed out in bold white letters under the words, "Say that again." Jungkook let out a slow breath through his nose. "They're going to twist it," he murmured. "They already are," Minji replied, sitting down. "But you should see the comments. People are eating it up, and not just fans. Like, everyone, K-pop stans, activists, journalists, even NFL Twitter's in on it." There was no producer coming in to shake his hand, no polite follow-up, just an intern saying, "Oh, you're clear," before disappearing down the hallway. That was fine. Jungkook wasn't looking for applause. On the drive back to the hotel, his inbox lit up with messages from friends, artists, actors, activists, from Seoul to LA to London. Some were proud, some just texted, "Damn." But the one that stood out came from his mom. "You were raised right. That man thought he had you figured out. He didn't." Still, not all the attention was praise. By the time the elevator reached their floor, headlines had already started to roll out. Jungkook clashes with Piers Morgan in on-air showdown. Jungkook stared at it, then let out a tired half-laugh. "Clashes," he muttered. "Every time someone like me sets a boundary, they call it a fight." Minji didn't say anything. She just pressed the elevator button and looked down. Upstairs, Jungkook finally kicked off his boots and collapsed into the quiet of the hotel room. The silence felt familiar. He flipped on the news for background noise and immediately saw his own face on the screen. No sound, just a muted panel of talking heads. One pundit said, "This is exactly why young activists lose public trust." That tone. Another countered, "He didn't even raise his voice. That was discipline." Jungkook muted it fully. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbed the back of his neck, and reached for the remote to power it all off, just as his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a notification. It was a call. Unknown number. Washington, D.C. area code. He let it ring twice, then answered. "This is Jungkook." A male voice on the line, steady, practiced. "Mr. Joan, this is Ed Ramos at CNN. We'd love to have you on tomorrow morning for a follow-up segment on your appearance tonight." Jungkook didn't answer right away. "I'll have my team get back to you," he said eventually. "Thanks." After he hung up, Minji looked up from her tablet. "You want me to say no?" Jungkook leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting out to the dark Los Angeles skyline. "I want you to say, we'll think about it." Because that was the truth. He wasn't running from the moment, but he wasn't about to get dragged into a media loop that twisted clarity into conflict and presence into performance. Not when he was trying to build something deeper than a soundbite. On social media, the clip had become more than viral, it had become a mirror. People weren't just reposting his words, they were responding to them. Stories poured in, people who'd been told at work to tone it down, smile more, not make everything about race. Parents posting about raising their kids to speak without apology. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was personal. Jungkook scrolled in silence, his thumb pausing on a selfie, a high schooler in Ohio holding up a neon sticky note with his quote written in bold black marker. "I'm not being small. But the tide wasn't only applause. By morning, the backlash had arrived, and it was loud. By 7 a.m., headlines were everywhere. Clapback, fierce exchange, Jungkook torches Piers Morgan, the usual internet fireworks. But underneath the clickbait was something more revealing. The divide. Cable news ran it on repeat. Podcasts dropped emergency episodes. Talk shows dissected it live. Some called him fearless. Others called him divisive. One conservative host called him an activist in an idol's jacket, like that was some kind of insult. Back in Seoul, the scent of reheated coffee drifted through his apartment as Jungkook sat quietly at his kitchen counter, the morning news murmuring in the background. He hadn't slept much, not because he was anxious, but because he knew what the next 48 hours would bring. Minji sat across from him, eyes darting between emails and headlines. We've got at least 20 new interview requests. NPR, MSNBC, BBC, even that loud guy from The Viewpoint wants you. Skip him, Jungkook said flatly. Already did, she replied. Outside, pale light crept across the rooftops. Do any of them want to talk actual policy? He asked. Minji hesitated. Most of them want a reaction. Of course they do, he muttered. Jungkook wasn't naive. He understood the game, maybe too well. What bothered him wasn't that he'd gone viral. It was that the moment people finally listened was also the moment they tried to reduce him to just a headline. That afternoon, someone from the National Assembly's PR office called his team, said they respected the spirit of his message, but gently warned that the media doesn't always reward clarity. The message wasn't subtle. You made them uncomfortable. Don't do it again. But Jungkook didn't flinch. He'd known the risk the moment he walked into that studio. What he hadn't expected was the reaction from some of his own peers. A senior lawmaker, someone Jungkook had once admired, posted a vague tweet about decorum and unity without naming anyone. But everyone knew who it was aimed at. A few middle-of-the-road pundits chimed in, calling for more restraint on both sides, as if calmly defending your dignity was somehow the same as dismissing someone live on air. But Jungkook didn't clap back. He didn't quote the tweet. He didn't hop on Instagram Live or post a fiery thread. He stayed quiet, deliberately. Instead, he met with his team, called a few grassroots organizers he trusted, and spoke via Zoom to a group of young artists from underfunded schools across Seoul. One teenager simply said, "I felt seen." That was the part no one put in headlines. No one talked about how much discipline it takes not to shout, not to interrupt, not to match fire with fire, but to sit there, steady and present, and push back without ever raising your voice. People didn't realize that not reacting sometimes took more strength than exploding. Still, it lingered in his mind. How fast the world wanted to turn that moment into a meme, a savage comeback, when what it really was a deliberate act of self-respect. That night, Jungkook sat alone at his desk. His laptop glowed dimly, lit with statements, interview invites, and 100 unread messages. They could wait. He opened his journal, a worn black leather notebook, and wrote 5 words. Not loud, just clear enough. Then he closed the book. He wasn't chasing the cameras. He wasn't chasing applause. But he also wasn't going to sit back while others tried to decide how he should show up. That choice, the quiet boundary he'd drawn, would stay with him far longer than the hashtags and headlines. A week passed. The internet moved on. A celebrity breakup, a leaked video, another political scandal. But clips from Jungkook's interview still quietly floated around, usually posted with captions like, "This is how you do it." He didn't miss the noise. He never needed it. What stayed with him were the private moments, the conversations no camera caught. Like the woman from Busan, mid-50s, an office admin at a public school, who pulled him aside after a community event and whispered, "I've been talked over in meetings my whole life. You said what I never could." She smiled, but her eyes held a sadness. "I just wish I'd said it sooner." Or the retired pastor who left a voicemail. "I didn't agree with everything, son," he said, "but I respected how you carried yourself." That's how grown folks talk. Keep speaking plain. It was these moments, these quiet human truths, that grounded Jungkook far more than any headline ever could. But those moments also reminded Jungkook why what happened on that stage mattered. It wasn't about clapping back. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about setting a standard. There's a pressure that comes with being in Jungkook's position, not just as a public figure, but as a young Korean artist stepping into Western spaces where decisions are made before you ever speak, and judged harder once you do. People like to say, just focus on the issues. But when your very identity is treated like a distraction, neutrality becomes a luxury you simply can't afford. He thought about that days later while speaking to a group of interns visiting from small colleges. They sat around a long glass conference table, notebooks open, eyes wide with the kind of hope he remembered from earlier days. One young man raised his hand and asked, "How do you know when to speak up and when to stay quiet?" Jungkook leaned back in his chair. "You don't wait for the moment to feel safe," he said. "You speak when the silence feels heavier than the risk." Pens scribbled furiously across paper. Another intern hesitated before asking, "How do you not get angry when people talk down to you?" Jungkook smiled, quiet and real. "I do get angry," he said, "but I've learned that anger doesn't need to be loud to be real. You don't always need volume to hold power." That wasn't something he'd learned from a book. That was earned, from rooms where his tone was picked apart more than his ideas, from interviews where restraint took more energy than answers, from moments when he wanted to explode but didn't, not out of fear, but out of purpose. After the meeting, a young woman lingered behind. She fidgeted with her notebook, then finally looked up and said, "I want to run for office one day, but I don't think people will take me seriously. I talk fast. I get emotional. People say I care too much." Jungkook looked at her, steady and kind. "Keep caring," he said. "That's the part they're scared of." She stood silent for a second, then smiled, wrote something down in her notebook, and walked out. Jungkook stood by the window afterward, watching the slow movement of cars far below. Outside, everything felt noisy, but in here, in this quiet moment, it felt clear. He knew his words on the Piers Morgan show had traveled far. He'd seen the clips, the debates, the edits, but what mattered more was where those words landed. Because that line, "I'm not being small," wasn't crafted for virality. It was a reminder that strength isn't always loud, that clarity has weight, that refusing to shrink is a kind of power all its own. And the story wasn't over. Not until the people watching understood what it meant for them. Most people won't ever sit across from a talk show host with millions watching. They won't be quoted or dissected or go viral overnight. But they will find themselves in rooms where they're spoken over, in jobs where their talent is questioned, in conversations where someone smiles politely while trying to make them feel small. That's where this story lives now. Not in a headline, but in the reflection it stirred. A young teacher in Tulsa sent him a letter. She said she played the clip for her students, not for politics, but to show them posture, dignity, presence. The teacher from Tulsa had written, "We talk about bullying, but we rarely teach what it looks like to stand up for yourself without striking back." And she was right. Another letter came from an older man in rural Oregon. "I didn't agree with everything you said," he wrote, "but I respected how you stayed calm. I've never seen someone take a hit and not throw one back." That stuck with me. That was the legacy of the moment. It wasn't that Jungkook won an argument with Piers Morgan. It was that he gave people something they didn't know they needed. Permission. Permission to be firm without being cruel, to take up space without apology, to correct without retaliating. In a culture obsessed with clapbacks and takedowns, that kind of presence, quiet, steady, unwavering, is rare and powerful. And that's the deeper message. You don't have to yell to be heard. You don't have to shrink to be accepted. You don't owe anyone the version of yourself that makes them comfortable at your expense. When Jungkook walked into that studio, he wasn't trying to go viral. He came to speak honestly. What he walked out with was louder than any headline. A blueprint. A blueprint for every woman who's ever been told she's too much. For every young person who's been told they're too emotional. For every Asian voice told to stay polite. stay soft, stay small, when all they did was speak clearly. This story is a reminder. You don't need permission to be whole. You don't need applause to be right. And you don't need to change your tone just to fit someone else's comfort zone. So if you're wondering how this connects to you, ask yourself, where have you made yourself smaller just to survive a room? Where have you stayed quiet? Not because you were wrong, but because you feared the label. And more importantly, what would happen if you stopped doing that? What would happen if, the next time someone tried to define your worth by your delivery, you looked them straight in the eye and said, I'm not being small? Because once you do, everything shifts. They'll feel it. Some will respect it. Some will resent it. But they won't forget it, and neither will you. If this story meant something to you, share it. Send it to someone who needs the reminder. Speak the words out loud if you have to, and subscribe, because we tell stories that don't just inform, they reflect something real. Your voice matters, exactly the way it is.